Check 1, 2. We are live according to that in the upper corner. We'll go ahead and share the desktop. And we'll share. I thought I turned my phone off. Why is it doing that? It's reminding me that I have class. And now it's reminding me that I have a Google Hangout live that I need to be at. Oh, well, that's good because it's this Hangout right here. Oh, look at that screen. Isn't that cool? Not really. So we're sharing out the screen, and that's cool. Introducing collections. Who cares about that stuff? Let's go into Blackboard. We'll log into the class and grab a little lecture file. And we'll talk about restoring backups. Bring that mic a little closer there. There we go. Oops, not 10. We want 9. Let's see if it'll go back to 9. It did. Yay. Apologize for coughing through this thing. My asthma's kind of kicking up. All right, so here we go. Ye old touchscreen. Gosh, gotta love that thing. All right, so first of all, when we talk about backing up, you know, a strategy for backing up, let me see if I can make that a little bit bigger. Look at there. Man, I'm loving this computer and the whole touchscreen thing. This technology is pretty cool stuff.
But when it doesn't work, it sucks.
Oh, when it doesn't work, it does suck. Gordon, you are absolutely correct. All right, so, excuse me, take a drink. This is one of those great challenges of being an IT person. About the last thing you have time for is practicing recovery, you know, of servers, you know. And of course, it's one of those insurance things. You hope you never have to do it. What you don't want to find out is when you have to do it, you don't have the data to do it with, right? So, yeah, I've shared with you a couple times when indeed I've had to send a disk off to have it recovered because someone thought they were backing it up. You know, in one case, we were called into a site where there didn't appear to be a backup to a disk, and there indeed wasn't. And the reason being, the server was being backed up, but they put an additional disk and created an additional volume to store things on, okay? Copied over from the old volume to the new one and never reset the backup or reconfigured the backup to back up the new volume. Yep. To point to the new volume. So this, of course, became a pretty serious issue. The way we solved it was pulling out the disk, sending it to a data recovery company that charged them thousands of dollars to recover about 80% of the data. Okay, so we don't want that to happen. In order to be prepared for backups, it says a written server recovery plan that outlines roles and responsibilities, as well as the steps necessary to recover your servers, is critical to reducing the overall downtime and loss of productivity. So what does this mean? It means that in this document, we should know what we're backing up, how we're backing it up, and more importantly, from where we can recover. Okay? So how do we do this? Today with virtualization, it's easy to practice. Okay? It wasn't so easy if you had a hardware device in there called a server and you had nothing to restore it to practice. The first practice you were going to get is if you had to restore it. So the problem was, it was always, for me, this thought in the back of my head of, what if my data, for some reason, doesn't restore? You know? So what would you do? And then, of course, back in the day, restores were such that there wasn't the ability to restore to different hardware. Okay? So consequently, you had to have two of the exact same boxes if you wanted to back up and test your restore, you know? So, of course, just like with workstations, you definitely needed a backup. You know, so in the case of Columbia Aircraft, we always had a backup server of some sort that we could restore another server to in case of a complete catastrophe. Motherboard goes down, you know, RAID controller goes down, whatever the case may be. So let's look at some things, who will be on the recovery team from IT and what will each of their recovery responsibilities be. So if we have multiple servers and multiple people in IT, we really want multiple people to be able to restore servers at the same time so that we don't have to sequentially do restore of servers. Now, there is one server that in the case of a catastrophe, we need to restore first. And which one would that be in a Windows environment? The DC, the domain controller, right?
I was gonna ask a question not related to the DC in particular, but
Yeah.
when they talked about knowing what's on each server and how to restore it, is that kind of how they determine what roles and features you want to install on each server? Because that impacts the ways it can be backed up and the ways it can be recovered.
Yeah, and the ways it's restored. So, for example, the way we back up and restore SQL Server and databases, okay, will be different than how we back up and restore Active Directory, right? Would be different than how we back up and restore, say, a web server. So we really need to understand, and the ways we can recover is, do I have to do a bare metal restore to restore my Active Directory? No, I could just restore the Active Directory portion itself. If I backed it up, the DNS itself, DHCP, so all of those need some sort of backup. Now, one of the big backups that's missed that most of your third-party backup software is going to catch is if we're doing any kind of dual booting, we need to back up that boot record. Okay. Now, in a full metal restore, we're grabbing and we're backing up an image, right? And so what we know the image is an exact copy of everything that's on that server in a moment in time. Okay. So we could always restore it that way, but if we just need to restore one or two files or even one volume of many, do we have to do a bare metal restore? And the answer is no. So do you know how many servers you have and where they are located? Main office, branch office, and so on. So, back in the day when I interviewed out at Canita Resort, they had servers all over that place. They had servers that sat underneath desks in offices. Maybe one of the reasons why I didn't take the job. So, do you have a current network topology map? So again, documentation, we have to remember to keep that documentation not only on site, but also off site in case of a disaster. Okay. So a lot of times, and we're going to talk about redundancy here, how we can sort of do redundancy, and I'll share with you how we used to do some of our client servers. So do you have the specs on each server, memory, drive space, etc.? What if I need to order another server? I definitely need to know what the hardware requirements are, and at least match them. So which servers need to be recovered first? So if we have an old archive server, with 16 terabytes of data, I don't need to recover it before I recover any server that's in play in operation, right? In our daily operations. So, so thinking about an environment, a standard business environment where we have email databases, some web servers, some SharePoint, those. Again, we've already determined what's the first server we need to restore in the case of catastrophe. The DC, right? Because everything's going to function within Active Directory. What might be the second server we put up in a business? All right. Exchange was the answer I was looking for. Why?
It's got all the communications.
And if nothing else, even if we can't operate, we still need to communicate. We need to communicate with our customers, with our vendors. Yes, we're okay, but those parts that you were going to ship us, hold off on those because right now we have no place to put them, right? Or we want to send out a group thing, to all of our customers who are waiting for things. Our building burned down. Here's our contingency plan, right? So communicate, communicate, communicate. So we would put up the Exchange server, then we would go after the operational servers in whatever order the company determined would be priority. Okay, so it may be SharePoint first, it may be the databases. In a lot of cases, the next thing would be our ERP system. Okay, so which servers do you have to recover first? What is the step-by-step procedure from data recovery process on each? Here is my suggestion for that. You should have documentation that any introductory IT person can follow to recover a server. Go grab this thumb drive. It has Windows, you know, the pre-boot Windows environment, Windows PE on it. Plug it in. Connect it to this IP address, which is our SAN network. It has our storage. Recover this partition, whatever the case may be. Recover this file. Okay. Now, doesn't that all sound just beautiful?
Yeah.
Yeah. Realistically, how much time do you have to do all that stuff? No. When are you going to wish you had done it?
When you have to.
When you have to do it. How will you know, test that things are back to normal after a restore? Now, one of the suggestions I always make when doing a restore, don't restore over the old data. Okay. So let's say I get a call from marketing and marketing says, we need to restore the special projects folder. Okay. Well, what in it do we need to restore? Well, there was, you know, there's like 5 or 6 or 7 things that seem to be missing. Somebody accidentally deleted them from the network, and as we know, they're gone, right? Well, what I would do is I would restore at a folder level, and what I would do is go in and instead of having it overwrite, I would change the folder name special projects to _old. That way I don't overwrite the data that already exists there. Okay. So then I'll restore the whole folder. I'll make sure it's up. And what that also allows me to do is compare that I have the data I think I have. Oh, this file wasn't one that was deleted, but it's here, you know. So when is the last time you performed a test restore to make sure your backups were working correctly? Well, at Columbia Aircraft, and again, this was hard back then because we didn't leverage a lot of virtualization. Today, I can use my Acronis backup from this machine and literally restore my server to a virtual machine and just compare the two. All the way down to the disk space, right? Compare the disk space, do a quick audit of some files and folders, and off I go. So, restore files and folders. This is the most common. So if a user accidentally deletes or overwrites a file or a folder on a network share, you have 2 options. Access the share and restore the previous version of the whole share, or use Windows Server Backup to restore the data. Of course, they're talking about Windows Server Backup. We could use any third party to back up. Okay.
How thorough is their backup?
Well, it's thorough enough that you can be assured that you're going to get your data back, you know. But what you find is most people go out and find a third-party tool that just makes it easier. I think there's also this sort of trust that goes on that if I'm really backing up, I need to be using a third-party tool, okay? However, one of the ways that we keep from, and this is, some of this stuff is redundant, we've talked about it before, having shadow copies, okay, or volume shadow copy, or, you know, so in this case, you know, basically what it's doing each time it creates a copy, we set when we want a copy to be created, okay? So we could say at noon, create a copy, okay? And then if after noon, someone deletes the file, we can at least get it back to noon, okay? Now, a copy works similar to an incremental backup in the fact that what it's going to back up, we have the original file, it's only going to create a copy of the changes, okay? So in restoring that previous copy, we're actually restoring that original plus the changes. Does that make sense? Now, why does it do it? Why doesn't it just create yet another copy of the whole file?
Because it doesn't rewrite, it doesn't take time and space to rewrite everything, so it only looks to rewrite the items that have been modified.
Right. So A, we gain a bunch of space, and the backup, or in this case, the ability to create a volume shadow copy, is very short. Okay, because we're only backing up the things that have changed. Okay, so restoring volumes, data volumes can be restored using Windows Server backup. Yes, restore a system volume, you use the recovery environment. Okay, so the WinRE tool and the Windows installation media. So a system state includes the operating system configuration files. What is included in system state differs depending on the roles performed by the server. Okay, so each time we install a role, the system state's going to change. Also impacts the process used to restore the system state when the time comes. Well, of course. Okay, because if it's an Active Directory, an AD, we have to restore those very differently. And remember, we talked about two different restores of AD. Authoritative and non-authoritative. And I think they bring that back up here. So full backups. So system state is included in full backups, bare metal recovery backups, and of course, just the system state backup. So if all we need is the system state, we don't need to restore all the associated data files and everything else and volumes that go with it. So restoring the system state, third-party tools make this really easy. It's a checkbox, okay, that says, okay, back up the whole computer, but also give me a backup of the system state. Also give me a backup of the registry. Also give me a backup of something else, whatever the case may be. So recovering the system state to a domain controller requires you to boot into the directory service restore mode, okay, because what we're basically doing is overwriting a database, right? That's what Active Directory is, okay? So special boot mode that is used to repair, yes, and recover Active Directory. So we boot to the DSRM, use msconfig to configure the server, enter the following command at a command prompt. So if we're dealing with a core server, easy to do, okay? Those are commands to definitely go in your book. And there it is. So if you don't select the perform an authoritative restore of Active Directory files option, you're performing a non-authoritative restore. So the restore domain controller will then use normal replication with other replication partner domain controllers to gather information that was changed after the backup was taken. So basically what it's saying is, I am not the authoritative domain controller. I'm going to back up to a point in time last Tuesday, and then all the other domain controllers that are still functional are going to synchronize with me and bring me up to date. Okay? Now that works well if what you're trying to restore is not something that's already missing, okay? Or that needs to go back. So let me give you an example of this. Somebody did not back up an object in Active Directory and deleted it, okay? And then some changes happened, whatever the case may be. Now we need to restore that object. And when I restore it, I want to know that I'm restoring it to that point in time, because the changes that were made after that point in time are not what I want it to be. That's an authoritative, okay? So an authoritative performs an authoritative restore, gives you the ability to increment the version number of the object. So again, the version may be last Tuesday's version. And I know that's what I want to restore to. All you other domain controllers, you now synchronize with me as it pertains to this change. So I am the authority. I don't care what's changed since. We're coming back to this point in time. Object will then appear to be newer than the existing version of the same object. So consequently, when synchronization happens between the domain controllers, the other domain controllers will see this as the authoritative server and make changes to match our recovery. Perform authoritative restore, the NTDS util. Restore consists of 2 steps. So you perform the non-authoritative restore from your backup, and then you can perform the authoritative restore of the deleted objects. So if we accidentally deleted an object and we want to get it back to a point in time, that's what we would do. So there's the command line. In this case, what we're restoring is an OU, name sales, and all the objects beneath it. So we use the NTDS util, activate instant NTDS. We tell it it's authoritative restore. What are we going to restore? The OU from the contoso.com domain. And wait a minute. I don't think that's the correct order. Should be CN equals OU, DC equals COM, DC equals contoso. Don't hold me to that, but I think that's a mistake. I think the COM comes before the root is normally listed before the parent in most commands. So how do we get around this? Was we know, the great use of yield recycle bin on a local computer. Okay. Now, of course, the problem with this is the recycle bin works well if we're storing data locally. If we're storing data on the network and we delete it, is it going to save back to a network share? No. This is where volume shadow copy came into play, because although we've deleted the object, we still have the shadow copies. So we can actually go in and restore from last Tuesday. It's deleted the current object, but we could go back into volume shadow copy and grab it again. And the reason we like volume shadow copy, well, the reason we don't is it takes up space, okay? And it uses resources. But the reason we love it is I don't have to go back to my backup and whatever media it is and go through this huge process to restore a 15K Word document that someone has deemed the most important document of their whole job, right? So it's like right click on that and do it yourself. So with Active Directory Recycle Bin, as we make changes to Active Directory, if we've configured it, the objects go into the recycle bin, and just like with the recycle bin, we can go and restore the object. Okay. So it's possible to do the new directory state that replicates tombstone states that were in previous versions of Active Directory. So it only keeps it, though, however, for 180 days. If there's something we need to restore after that, we're going to have to do an authoritative restore or non-authoritative to bring that back. So bare metal recovery, this is, we've either lost the whole server or we've gotten a new server, okay? So I have only used the tool once from Acronis, but in my Acronis tools, I have come on now. There it is. I have the ability, okay, under tools to do what's called a universal restore. So before you start recovery to dissimilar hardware, please create an Acronis universal restore media with this media builder. So what it does is it pulls out the specific hardware information, okay, and overwrites it with the hardware information that's on the computer. So when I finish the restore, I have the new hardware. Now I've got to go in and I may have to install some drivers, okay? During the process, it can have me do that, okay? So this would be like building a brand new computer that has a RAID array. Before we can actually install the operating system, we have to configure the RAID array. So before, in this case, we can do the restore, we have to configure the hardware. Okay. But the cool thing about that is suddenly if I need to, what are you doing there? Really? Biocronus. There we go. That was kind of silly. So Microsoft, of course, has the ability to using a system image. So if we've created a full image, we can do a bare metal recovery, allows you to restore the server without having to load the operating system beforehand. That's how, I'm so dang old, that's how you had to do it if you were using Windows backup. So that's another reason, Gordon, that Windows backup wasn't real popular, is it only worked if I then restored the operating system, then restored my backup over the operating system that I just installed. And how painful can it be to install an operating system? Very. Even more painful when you're trying to do a restore. It does require that you have your Windows installation media, from which to boot, of course. So we go in, we boot from the media, and it'll start giving us general drivers so that we can reach out to, say, a network share that might have the backup, general drivers to reach out to an external drive that might have the backup software. So, today, with the way recovery partitions are on computers, one of the challenges is the recovery partition is only going to bring the computer back to how you received it initially. So if you've installed any applications, you would have to reinstall those applications, right? Even if you said, recover my computer and save my data, okay, we still have to reinstall the applications. So we can use Windows RE, as our pre-boot environment to repair the system. Safe mode, getting into safe mode, so several ways to access the Windows recovery environment. We can do it through safe mode. We can do it through the RE, settings, the charms bar, go away. I've already reordered you. Interesting thing about Trend Micro. So my Trend Micro subscription expired. If I go in and click renew on here, it's like $56 to renew for 1 year, 3 machines. I went out to Amazon, it's $31. If I uninstall and reinstall the software, it's $32.76 if I want to upgrade to their premium version, which, by the way, gives me 5 copies of their software. So go figure. Guess what most people do?
They just do it for $59.
Yeah, they click and renew. Yep. So the Windows recovery environment, we can continue, we can troubleshoot, turn off our PC. Now, they have built this to where one of the things that will keep this from working is they needed to do some improvements on securing Windows. Because if we were just able to do this, okay, without authenticating to the machine first, we could then overwrite a machine when we shouldn't be able to. So as we know now, if we want to do a lot of these recoveries, we have to authenticate in the machine, go to the area of recovery, and then choose what recovery we're trying to do. And it makes perfect sense, because if not, then anybody could override our machine. Of course, with any bare metal restore, if they have access to the backup files, they have access to the hardware, they could technically do a restore. How important is it for us to keep our backup files secure? Hugely. So in advanced boot options, I know you all have seen this. You've probably booted into advanced boot. where we can repair the computer. We can go into safe mode with networking, safe mode with a command prompt, depending on where our problem is. So if we have a virus, a lot of times we'll go into safe mode, run our virus checker from safe mode, okay, get rid of the virus, okay, because it will also get rid of it from restore points, or delete the restore points as we do it. Enable boot logging, low resolution video, last known good configuration. That's always the big savior, right? Man, I don't want to restore. Let's go to the last known good configuration. And I hope I don't lose a ton of stuff. For programmers, a debugging mode, automatic start on system failure, driver signature enforcement. That is one. So disable driver signature enforcement allows drivers containing improper signatures to be loaded. Well, what constitutes a driver that's been signed?
It's just been approved by Microsoft.
It's been approved by Microsoft. But what Microsoft has done now with Windows, I think it was Windows 8 and 8.1, is said, we're only going to install signed drivers. And what they're doing is they're trying to push the quality of their product from the outside in. So if you're a vendor, you want to build a printer that has a driver, you need to come to Microsoft, allow us to test it and prove it before you put it out in the wild. Okay? But what if you have something that you really need to install and you trust it, and now suddenly you can't because, well, it's not a signed driver. So, by the way, we can go in and disable that from the registry as well.
Oh, you do the registry as well?
Yeah.
You can BIOS, you can do one or the other.
Right. Pretty sure you can do it in the registry as well. I think there's a registry setting for that. So, command line tools, the boot rec for troubleshooting boot sectors. So this is pre-boot. If we have a multi-boot machine, we don't tend to do multi-boot machines anymore. Because if you want another operating system, stick it on a what? A VM. Yeah. Format partitions, so I remember the pre-boot environment in Windows XP, where you actually had to run, the little floppy disk, and format the partition before you could install the operating system. Formatting wasn't built in as a pre-boot to the operating system. Y'all realize now when we install an operating system, we get in a pre-boot environment first where we configure the hardware to prepare it for the operating system. So more command line utilities for system file checker, disk partitions. So outside of the OS, we can shrink, expand, create, delete partitions. We all hopefully know what safe mode's for and things that we would do in safe mode. Basically a great way for us to troubleshoot a computer. It will load just what's needed to start the computer, not all your third-party drivers and your signature files and all that stuff. So msconfig. Anybody use msconfig to speed up the boot of their computer? Oh man, and today everything you install has some system manager that as soon as you start up your computer is going out to the web, my favorite is HP, to say, hey HP, do you have an updated driver for my HP printer? And so it's doing that every single time. As IT professionals, when do we want to update the printer?
When it stops working.
When it stops working, when something breaks, right? The old, if it's not broke, don't fix it. However, why do you think that all these third-party peripheral vendors building these clients to go out and opt to check all the time if there is an update?
Why do they?
Yep.
Other than marketing, they capture everything you go onto their website.
Liability. Because this is software. And can we inject malicious code into a driver? Yeah. So if somebody injects malicious code into a driver and I'm not proactive about updating my computer and my HP driver file is now infected, who am I liable to go back to and say, hey, you guys are idiots? HP. But is HP really responsible? To a certain degree they are. But if I didn't update my driver on a regular basis, and this is 6 months after the fact, are they really responsible? Not really. Okay. But the idea is to keep it up to date. So how many people have not used MS-config? Or at least gotten in and played with it? Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. It's fun to screw things up. That's how we learn. So system restore checkpoints. So again, we've talked about virtual machines. We've talked about, creating snapshots and checkpoints, Hyper-V checkpoints, virtual machine checkpoints, our volume shadow copy checkpoints. Okay. In 2008 and later, server environments do not support the creation of system restore points anymore. It just was an inefficient way to do it. Okay. And guess what they found out? What do most IT professionals do? Do we have system restore points set on all the computers in the network? No. Turn it off. It's a resource. It's a resource hog. It takes up disk space. And if I know that I don't have anything on a computer that I can't restore with an image, if I can restore it with an image and all of my data that changes is being restored on a network share, do I really need to have a restore point for your computer right there? No. So the boot configuration data store replaces the boot INI. If we are creating dual boot systems, okay, we may need to go in and modify this. One of the most standard modifications made in the boot directory is the time before it decides to boot to the most current operating system. Can anybody in here tell me, in what order do you install operating systems if you're creating a dual boot, quad boot, tri-boot, whatever system? Which one do you do first?
The secondary one.
What do you mean the secondary one?
So if you wanted to boot, have a Windows and a Linux one, and you wanted the Windows to be the primary one, you install Linux first, and then Windows would be the one on top of it. So it's the last, kind of that last right of Windows concept.
So, yep. And we can take that into just Windows. So let's say I want to boot XP 7 and 8. Which one do I install first?
Which one you want to be the primary boot?
Not necessarily. Because with the boot sequence, with the boot files changing, I need the oldest boot file to be installed as the primary boot. Okay, because booting to XP is not going to support the boot configuration data store. So I need the boot INI. So boot configure data store, command line, so I can add, modify, delete entries, import, export entries if I need. Very seldom are we messing with that. When do we mess with it? What if that's the only component that's gotten corrupted? Do I need to restore the whole computer? No, I just need to restore this. And I can make a copy, by the way, or a backup of this partition that has this information in it. So multi-boot system configuration boot. After 30 seconds, change the setting to wait for only 10 seconds. So this is the idea that, like Gordon said, my primary OS is what I'm going to boot to the most. I don't need to wait 30 seconds or hit buttons, to choose which one it's going to boot into. I can, lower that down, give myself enough time if I need to change to boot into another one. So there's our export command for exporting the boot store and importing the boot store. Okay. So boot recovery tool for recovering that boot sector. Export the store, after we back up the store, remove the hidden read-only and or system attributes from the file so that we can modify it if we need to. If we're building multiple machines, we can take a copy off of one, restore it to another. So there's our lesson summary. So the biggest thing that most people, most IT professionals don't do is practice restores. And you really, like it suggests, you really want to have this process down. So if you have to do a restore, you know you have the data, you know you understand or have a system in place to do the restore. Hugely important. Because so many times, if you haven't practiced it, I'll give you a great example. I was backing up my computer using a Cronus, and it was working grand. It was backing up, doing the backup thing. I was backing it up to, remember, a solid state drive, an external solid state drive. And it worked. And then when I went to try to recover it one time, it wouldn't recover because it wouldn't recognize my backup media. Because there was no driver in the little default recovery tool for my specific media. So what I had to do was go out and create in true image a restore. Okay, a little Windows RE. Because in the Windows RE, there were more default drivers, and thankfully, a driver for my solid state. But when did I figure that out? When I needed to do the restore. Remember that? How would that have been? How popular would I have been if I'm figuring this out for a server that is the email server?
Well, you would have been popular, all right.
What?
You would have been popular, all right, for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, for all the wrong reasons. Yeah. All right. So, folks, realistically, I personally feel what we're going to look at next in lesson 10, configuration site level fault tolerance. We're not necessarily beginning by talking clusters. We're talking about an alternative to a cluster. Okay. And the reason being, what we're talking about now is not a single site, but having redundancy at another site. Okay. So what this means is we're going to be transferring a bunch of data over a WAN link. And how do we pay for WAN links today? Huh? Bandwidth. So how much bandwidth do I need to pay for every day to have the ability to restore something from another site? It can become very costly, right? So one of the options, especially with Hyper-V, is Hyper-V Replica. So we can think of this sort of as an active passive. I would think of it more as just a copy, because in essence, what is a virtual machine? It's a file. So if we continue to just update that file on a non-running machine, we essentially have a copy of the running machine, right? But what we're not doing is having two files that have to communicate and synchronize over a WAN link. So we could think of this as the poor businesses or small businesses replication process. A backup per se. Okay. Is it a true backup? I would not trust it as a backup. So replica is an offline copy, which means a non-active copy of a virtual machine. Okay. Used as a spare server, which is stored on another central storage device at another site. So it tracks the write operations on the primary VM and then replicates the changes to the replica over a WAN link. So the only thing that is being changed are the, and being transferred over the WAN link are the changes. Enables you to restore virtual workloads to a point in time, depending on the recovery history selections from the VM. So how often are we doing this? If the primary site goes down, you can bring up the replica server in minutes. So one of the features, one of the things that we used to offer that this would make a lot easier is back in the day, one of the things that our clients didn't want to lose was their Exchange store, their Exchange server. Okay. So what we did is we went out and invested in a computer that we installed Exchange on, okay? And it sat in our office. Now, as we know with Exchange, most people today are using the Outlook web access interface. So that doesn't matter if it's sitting in your office or sitting in mine. In the failure of your primary Exchange server, I could then bring up my Exchange server because we were synchronizing the store, and I could quickly instantiate the store. DNS, was configured to be a primary secondary. So we house their secondary store, and within one Exchange server, I could do this for many companies. Now the cool thing was there was no resources really being used because everything was going into it saying, hey, here's an email that the other server that's running got. I'm going to put it here too. Oh, you deleted that? I'll delete it here. And then worst case scenario is I could give them our company's address, whack Exchange, whack their store, and they could get in and communicate. Was it high speed? No, because now they're connecting via the web, not locally. So with Hyper-V replication, we have a replication engine, a change tracker, so here's my original VM, here's my replica VM, here's some changes that I've made, so what's between? The change tracker says, here's a change, have I made the change there?
So
okay.
It's only replicating the changes.
Only replicating the changes, which means I'm not filing or transferring a bunch of data over a WAN link. A network module, and then of course a broker server role. The broker is who determines where, it has the information of where is the replica, how do I reach it, is it primary, and how often do I make replications?
When their primary Hyper-V or their primary server goes down, you have to bring up the replica Hyper-V. Then it's all over a WAN. Then the communication between them and their replica Hyper-V is over their WAN.
Over their WAN link. Yep.
So
But
it's cheap to maintain, expensive to. So you don't try to run off of that for too long. You use it while you're troubleshooting, fixing, restoring whatever the primary.
exactly. The other thing it allows you to do, most importantly, is create a better disaster recovery, without having multiple storage in both locations, etc. However, the storage attached to that Hyper-V needs to be replicated in both sites. So this can be costly.
Yeah, because now you've got to back up your replica as well.
Right. But if all I'm backing up is, if all I'm synchronizing is change from one to another, that's not a ton of data. So replicate servers that are part of a cluster, use the Hyper-V replication broker service. So this is the idea that in my site, I have an active cluster, and I just want to have that backup in case of a disaster at one site. I'm still operational. So enable replication between two VM hosts, configure replication from one or more VMs, and test that it works. How do you test that it works? Bring down the one VM.
Take one down.
Yeah. Of course, as we focus on security, that's a WAN link, and we would prefer to encrypt the information, flowing over that WAN link. Because even if it's a dedicated point-to-point WAN link, it's still probably going over the internet, which means someone has a router someplace that our data may be going through, where they could potentially capture our data. So enabling Hyper-V replication, we just go into the Hyper-V settings. We point it at the other site. So we're going to need some routing configuration going on, some security, since it's going over the web. HTTPS is a small encryption, very efficient encryption means of encryption, sorry. So enabling replication on one host, you need to configure the VMs to replicate. During the configuration, you must specify replication server name, options for the connection, and the virtual hard disk drives that you want to replicate, because all it's doing is changing a file somewhere. So it's just keeping two files current. And like Gordon pointed out, if we lose the primary, we have to manually bring up the secondary. It's not active. Okay. Now, it's not to say we can't create a site cluster, where one node is in one site and one node is in another. But at that point, they're constantly communicating with each other, right? And thus, a ton of data is going over the network. So initial replication method, send initial copy over the network or start replication immediately. A lot of cases, what we'll do is we'll create a replica. We can take it over the other side if it's large, and then start the replication. So good time to do this, create the replication on a Friday, move forward with the replication over the weekend when there's not a lot of changes to the device. So as if that's not enough, you can use Hyper-V replication, extended replication that will create a replica of your replica. Now, at the point we're doing this, maybe it's time to just get a cluster, okay? Because we're really creating a cluster if we're replicating a replica. And I don't mean a physical cluster. I mean, we're creating a mess. So since you're essentially running a second wizard to configure the replica, you can define different replication intervals between the first and the second replica. Well, that makes sense, in the fact that, so we're replicating from our operational box to a replica, then we're going to replicate the replica to a secondary replica. And we may not need that to replicate in real time. So multi-site clustering, companies have only one office, which is used to define a single site. The site goes down, the company would be essentially at a standstill, until a minimum number of servers were brought up and the data was restored from offsite backups. So in our disaster recovery plan at Columbia Aircraft, we actually were going to use, and we actually did this one time strictly for phone, where we had a disaster. Our communication lines were cut. What we were able to do is call our televendor. They set up some extensions, rerouted our lines, and we had some folks go down to the vendor in downtown Bend and manage the phone lines. Because nothing's worse than you call a company when you know they're open and it just rings and rings and rings, right? So the same thing holds true here with servers. What if my site goes down? Now, first of all, with Columbia Aircraft being a single site manufacturing location, if we lost that site, we're really out of business. No matter how quickly I can bring up servers, such as an Exchange server, what we're going to be communicating with our customers is, well, yeah, your plane was in the last stall, ready to be wheeled out, and the building just went up in flames. I'm sorry, we're going to have to figure out a new building or rebuild the building so that we can start manufacturing airplanes. If the site goes down, the company would be, again, at a standstill. Larger companies, this type of solution is unacceptable. You bet. You think Microsoft would be okay with losing their primary location of business? Probably not. A backup site needs to be established so that it can be brought up online and allow the company to function while the primary site is repaired and brought back online. Now, what does this mean? For our customers, we were able to utilize our location as a backup location for some of their servers. And we always gave the option to build some redundancy at our location instead of in case their site failed. So at the beginning of the lesson, replicas were used to make a backup copy of the servers. The replicas can be used to replicate to a second site over a WAN link. However, the Hyper-V replication is a cold server, i.e. we must bring it online. Well, if we don't have the time to do all that and bring something online, we all know a cluster works. Okay? So what's the difference between the local clusters we've talked about and the site cluster? Just the communication between them. Okay. The other thing though is normally with a cluster at a single site, the two clustered machines are hitting the same storage, right? Here, what we're going to need is storage at each location. Okay. Because if site A goes down and that's where the storage is, site B better have their own storage, right? So we could go cluster to SAN, cluster to SAN. If we're building this, we are most likely going to invest and make sure all of our machines are clustered.
So we're going to put a cluster to each location. Those are going to be connected to the SAN.
Connected to SANs.
So each one's going to have a cluster connected to the SAN at each location.
Exactly. So let me give you an example. I've got a network at my primary location A. It has 2 domain controllers, an Exchange server, a SQL server, an ERP server, and I don't know, a web server. Okay? And I virtualize all of that. It's still vulnerable.
Yeah.
Even if I create a local cluster, which keeps it from going down, if my building burns, I'm still out of business. I have a SAN storage there. At the other location, to do a multi-site failover cluster, I have to have also storage that is also synchronizing in addition to the servers synchronizing at the other location. So what are we talking about here? A lot of time, a lot of money, and if we lose that WAN link, a lot of configuration.
Yeah, because they have to, the SANs have to communicate with WAN links.
Right, and the clusters would have to communicate their heartbeat over a WAN link, because when does the site B cluster know to come up and become active? Exactly. Yep. And think about the DNS configuration of this too.
Actually, I'd have to go read it because I can't.
Yeah. I mean, it's very complex.
Yeah.
Because we would have a primary server, the cluster, the site B server would become secondary in the DNS record. So, but what does this mean? Because of the slower WAN link, there is no shared storage that cluster nodes on the 2 sites can use. Because this is slow, what's it going to be next year? It could be, right? I mean, could we have, 50 gig per second connection between 2 locations?
Yeah, absolutely. Next year's not going to be slow. It's going to be faster next year.
It'll be faster. And then suddenly, maybe we could communicate with the storage, but we still have an issue of if site A completely gets demolished, so does my storage. So we never want to leave the storage at one location.
No, that's what I'm saying. If it gets faster next year, then you're still going to have to do that. Then you could maybe get to the point where you can actually synchronize the SAN across the WAN.
Exactly.
You have to do that versus just the heartbeat.
Exactly. Yep. So still, what are we communicating with the active passive cluster is just the change. Yep. Yeah. They do not.
They do. That one does.
Oh, well, this one, yeah. Okay, so a couple do.
No, about 4 or 5.
Well, guess what we can do?
Turn the air conditioner on.
We can. Yes. All right, hold on. Except I don't think I can just pause this. I think I have to stop this. I do. See how close we are to the end here real quick. I think we are.
Yeah, we are. We're like,
So, yeah. Quorum and failover, but remind me as it gets warmer. I like it warm, so it doesn't bother me. So well, that's why I said it hasn't bothered me. So
so to set up the SAN this way, if you're using site A or you're using a multi-site cluster with SAN as a backup,
right.
To get site B to start with, you've got to put a copy of site A onto site B.
You bet.
So you've got to kind of take an image or whatever, a backup, and load it on site B so it knows where to start. So it knows to only back up. Now it's like, okay, I know where we're both at. Now I'm only going to back up the differences.
Right.
So do you occasionally do another full backup and redo B so it's just like we were talking about last week in our backup schedule.
Right.
Every so often you go full backup and then you do incrementals. Do you do the same thing on B, or do you always only run it at the incremental backup level?
Well, I can, depending on how I'm doing the backup,
Yeah.
I could constantly go and restore my secondary stand with the incremental.
Okay.
Okay. But depending on how much data we're talking about,
Yeah.
if first of all, if we're talking about a large organization, I can probably afford fiber optic, which means I'll instantiate both SANs at a point in time, and then just have one synchronized as the primary to the backup secondary cluster. You know,
Yeah. If you can afford the fiber. Then.
if you can afford the fiber, yeah. So, quorum and failover. So understand WAN links will have a slower bandwidth and a higher latency. Since failover is triggered by missing heartbeats, you're going to need to tweak the quorum and the failover settings. So maybe locally 5 missed heartbeats is great. Maybe on a WAN link, we're going to say, you know what, don't take over till you've missed 10, 15, consecutive heartbeats. So by default, the heartbeat occurs once every second. A heartbeat occurs once every second, every 1,000 milliseconds. If a node misses 5 heartbeats in a row, another node will initiate failover. This isn't going to work on a WAN link. Okay, because realize the WAN link and the time and the bandwidth, we can actually be sending those 5 heartbeats and it'll receive them, but not in the time it's expecting.
Yeah, not 5,000 milliseconds.
Exactly. Yeah. So, especially if we're sending them to China, right? They got to go through that whole Chinese firewall thing. So, sites are geographically dispersed. You cannot use quorum configuration that requires a witness disk. It makes sense. We can only do that when we're local. Okay. Because where's the witness disk going to be? In the site that just failed?
No, it's going to be the offsite.
Well, what if the offsite, now suddenly the primary site has to be communicating with the witness disk all the time? And if we lose that WAN link, what's going to happen? Yeah, we'll lose our quorum. So multi-site failover. So, high-level steps should perform when configuring a multi-site failover. If I'm building a multi-site failover cluster, I'm bringing in an engineer who does this. Thank you, Dale. Come configure it for me. Do a set it and forget it. Teach me how it works and who to call if I have problems. This is just stuff we don't tend to do a lot. Sure that you have reliable storage replication mechanism between sites. Yes. Make sure you have the basic network services available at each site. AD, DNS, DHCP. Yeah, it makes good sense. This is why if we have the resources, putting DNS and DHCP on an Active Directory domain controller works very well. Run a validate configuration wizard on all the nodes. Correct any problems, create a cluster, create the cluster quorum, do the failover, and then test it. Test it. So the global update manager used to coordinate state challenges within the cluster, such as when the cluster node is taken offline. So if we have a challenge, the global update manager we're talking about, so this is used in site clustering. So you can configure the cluster manages global updates, manager. So 0, all write, local read, majority read and write, majority write, and local read. So it's just how we're building that dispersed cluster. Best method to restore a cluster is to restore from a backup, especially if we have multi-site. Because remember what we can do is we can take a backup of the running cluster, restore it, okay, and then just do the configuration changes to bring it back up on the node. Or if we have a backup, when we were doing a small cluster with a NAS, we backed up both nodes, full, and then backed up the data on the NAS separately. So but we were always able to restore any of the specific parts of the cluster. So backup a cluster configuration, the cluster must be running, must have quorum. I'm not sure that's necessarily true with third party. Restore a failover cluster from a backup, restore the cluster configuration, the data on the cluster disks or whatever, you know, and then just allow them to synchronize essentially. So when you restore a single cluster node from a backup, you can perform one of the following. So non-authoritative or authoritative. So it makes sense. And then our summary. So if you're the IT person and you're doing a bunch of, for a small business, you're the IT person, it might make some sense to, at your house, you know, by the way, let me shut off the recording here while I'm thinking about it.